A lot of people don't realize that the American Revolution was several different revolutions all wrapped into one. That is, there were lots of groups who were fighting for liberty, freedom, independence, and not all of them were the people we think of today as the patriots or the American revolutionaries. If you take a look at Native American or Indian women, you get a very different perspective on the American Revolution. Native Americans, who obviously had been here much longer than Europeans, were not naive or innocent, politically innocent people. Throughout the 17th and 18th century, Native Americans understood how to play one rival against another. That is, they knew how to side with the English against the Spanish or side with the French against the English, and in doing so, they knew how to protect their own communities and often get rewards for their loyalties, so to speak, to the side that they had aligned themselves with. It was much easier for Native Americans to feel warmly toward the French, because in French Canada and the Ohio Valley, the French came largely to hunt and to trade for pelts, beaver pelts. They were not really farmers. Much of Canada is not going to yield much in the way of staple crops. And so they came over as fur traders and trappers. And because of that, they weren't invading, in a sense, or trying to seize the land of the Native Americans. The English, on the other hand, were from the very beginning agriculturalists, farmers, and land was what they wanted. Also, the English tended to be fairly narrow-minded about other cultures. They viewed the Indians, especially in the 17th century, they viewed the Indians as just an inexplicable group of people. American colonists and English travelers would go into Native American communities and try to interpret what they saw going on. And from a modern, much more sophisticated point of view, you would find this hilarious. They could not comprehend either the sexual mores and marriage behavior of Native Americans, and they couldn't understand where power was. In English culture, men farmed and women did domestic activities. That was almost the definition of your gender. A man was a farmer, a woman was a housewife. But in Native American culture, on the whole, women were the farmers, the agriculturalists, and men supplemented the diet of the tribe or the clan or the community by hunting, and they protected the community. So imagine the surprise of English travelers when they arrived in a community in the summer, for instance, when Native American men didn't hunt. There was no tracks that they could follow in the snow, or so they would see women toiling in the soil, planting food, and they would see men in their minds sitting around doing nothing. What the men were doing was mending nets if they fished, or preparing weapons, or playing ball in order to keep in good physical shape. What the English saw was all these lazy, no-good-for-nothing men and women who must have been slaves. They couldn't comprehend that women would be the farmers. Even worse for them was they couldn't comprehend that many Native American tribes were matrilineal. That is, they traced families through the mother, which in fact made a great deal of sense because you always knew who the mother was as she was present at birth. And they would, Native Americans, instead of going to live in his home, would go to live in her family's log house or a dwelling of some sort, which also amazed the English. They were scratching their heads over that. Far more important than that, since there was no private property to pass down in Native American culture, it didn't really matter who fathered the son, the first son, the second son. Legitimacy was not the kind of issue that it was in a culture in which property passed from father to son. And so in some tribes, for instance, the men would go off hunting. The women were clearly self-sufficient. They were producing the food. If they decided they didn't like their husbands anymore, when the men came home, they would find their possessions outside the log house, and that would be a symbol, you're divorced, that is, you're gone. Well, you can imagine what the English thought of this. They were, pages and pages and pages were written about the scandalous behavior of Native American women, so that you get an image of Native American culture that is totally through the eyes of English culture and completely misreading what was going on. They couldn't understand that women had power, because in English culture, women had no formal power at all. And so while the men could decide to go to war, the women could decide not to give them any supplies to go to war with. And so the women could say, well, if you want to engage in this war, which we think is foolish, we're not going to give you any food. You're going to have to go off on your own, and good luck to you. And so though they didn't decide the war, they clearly had power to block the war or support the war if they wanted to. This was incomprehensible to English patriarchal, hierarchical society. So the relationships between the English and the Indians was always strained. There's always tension, there's always often violence, they are always viewed as enemies of one another. Or in modern parlance, the Indians were always the other from the point of view of the Englishmen, whereas the French were much more willing to learn the native language. They were much more willing to marry Indian women. There was no sense that these people were savages. And so you can imagine that in any confrontation, Native Americans would be likely to side with the French. Now, once the French were defeated in the French and Indian War, and that's why it was called the French and Indian War, because most of the Indians supported the French. When the French were defeated and they were driven out of Canada and the Northwest Territory, then the Native Americans couldn't play two sides against one another. They couldn't say to the English, if you give us guns, if you give us alcohol, if you give us tools, if you give us pots and pans, or whatever it is they wanted, we'll stay neutral, which many of them offered to do in the French and Indian War, and then turned around and sided with the French. They couldn't do that because there was no alternative to the English in that part of North America, in what we call the Eastern Woodlands, or east of the Mississippi River. When the American Revolution broke out, the choice was between supporting England, who they weren't so crazy about, or supporting the American colonists, who they definitely were not crazy about. Everybody knew that the Americans were land grabbers, that they would beg, borrow, steal, cheat to get Native American land. And much of early American history is the history of people moving west and engaging in all kinds of nefarious and often violent activity toward Native Americans, and the goal was to take their land. The Chickasaws and the Indians of the South, what was then the Southwest, what became Kentucky, West Virginia, Tennessee, knew that as soon as the war was over, if the Americans won the war, that they would be driven off their land. And they weren't going to be driven off their land into empty territory. They were going to be driven off their land into the arms of their own enemies. And so it was extremely dangerous to be told, go west, because there were tribes and clans who in fact were the bitter enemies and rivals of the people who were settled already in this land the Americans wanted to take. And so on the whole, Native Americans understood that while the English weren't great, the English were better than the Americans. One of the great leaders of this support for the English in the Northeast was a woman named Molly Brant. Now, most textbooks always have a picture of her brother, Joseph Brant, the great leader of the Mohawk Indians, but he wasn't the leader of the Mohawk Indians. He was the muscle, that is, he led the men in battle. But Molly Brant, as was not untypical, was the diplomat of the tribe. And it was Molly Brant who negotiated with the British in Canada and said, we'll support you, we'll fight on your side, we'll persuade members of other tribes to either be neutral or to support you. But in exchange, you have got to grant us tracts of land in what was then Canada so that we will have some place to go. Because even if you win the war, the Americans are going to try to take our land. And the British said, sure. The British said, fine. These Native Americans were not only good fighters, but they were fighting, and here's the part about it being many revolutions. What were they fighting for? They were fighting to remain independent. They were fighting for their own liberty. They were fighting for freedom, and they were fighting for their homeland. And so the very same words that we could use to define Patrick Henry or Thomas Jefferson, neither one of whom fought, by the way, except with their mouths. That is, they orated and they wrote, but they weren't actually warriors. But the very words that defined what Patrick Henry thought he was fighting for is what Molly Brant and Joseph Brant and hundreds, thousands of other Indians believed they were fighting for. They were fighting to preserve their own liberty. And so if you take a look at why the Indians sided on the whole with the British, and you understand what they thought was at stake, then you see the irony in the American Revolution if you think of it solely as a revolution by white American colonists against the king who they declared to be a tyrant, who wasn't really a tyrant at all. But that's another story. If you see it through the eyes of Molly Brant, then you understand that they are desperate to preserve their own heritage. They're desperate to preserve their own right to the land. And if you think, perhaps, that they were overwrought or they thought the sky was falling when it wasn't, you have to think about, if you move forward in history, you have to think about the Indians in Georgia. Because the Indians in Georgia did absolutely everything white society asked them to do. They said, have the right kind of family structure, women in the house, men in the fields. And the Indians, the Cherokees, said, okay, we'll do that. Become Christian, okay, we'll do that. Have a written language, okay, we'll do that. And in fact, they had a newspaper. And then when people thought there might be gold in the hills, what happened to those Indians? What happened to those Indians was what we call the Trail of Tears. That is, one way or another, no matter how hard Native Americans attempted to satisfy the demands of the dominant white society, at great expense, by the way, to women who lost their autonomy, who lost their identity as farmers. At great expense to them, it was never enough. That land was going to be taken away from them. And so you see it, there are very few written accounts And most of the written accounts about the confrontation of white women and Native American women are, of course, by the white women. It's almost as if you can't write it down, it didn't happen. And for this reason, Native American history has, for a long time, suffered, and it's only been ethnographers and archaeologists and anthropologists who've managed to reproduce the structure of Native American society. But it's very hard to find a Native American woman's account of her life. What we can find are the accounts of white women who became adopted members of Native American tribes. And since this is about women's history, I can't resist this digression. Often in Native American raids of white communities, Massachusetts, that is the areas that bordered Native American lands, women would be captured. And the Puritans in particular went to great lengths to redeem their captives. That is, to get back this flower of English womanhood from savages, from these heathen savages. And they would pay ransoms. And they would go and they would get the women and children, if there were children there. And in some cases, it had been several years, and the women had children from Native American men. And they would redeem them, and they would head back through the forest to civilization. And they would camp out for the night. And in the morning, when they woke up, the women were gone. The women had run back to the Native American community that they had been redeemed from, because in fact, for them, life was much more free. They had much more liberty, and they had a greater sense of themselves as significant and important people, and much more autonomy in the Native American community than they had in patriarchal, hierarchical, domestic life in New England. And we have accounts of some of the women who decided to stay, who wrote about why. And one of the central reasons was that housework on the frontier in white families, as on the frontier a century later when Little House on the Prairie tells about, it was lonely, it was isolated. But Native American women worked as a group, and they were allowed to bring their children with them into the fields, and it was friendly. It was a collective experience. And for many of these white women, this was such a difference and so much better life, better quality of life, that they preferred to stay as members of the Native American tribe. And so you can get insights into what it was like to be a woman in Native American society, not from Native American women, but from white women who became adopted members of that society. And you can read these in what we call captivity narratives. You can also read them in a very wonderful book by John Demos called The Unredeemed Captive, which tells the story of decades-long attempt by a minister and his family in Massachusetts to get a woman to quote, come home. And her repeated attempts to explain to them, I'm very happy where I am, I'm married to a wonderful man, I have a good life, I really don't want to come back to Puritan society. And so you can get a sense, the best sense, I think, written sense, if you're hoping to teach it, from these captivity narratives, rather than hoping to find a Native American woman who, through some miracle, has decided to write a diary in English.